The story we all know is simple. Amelia Earhart, the famous pilot, tried to fly around the world. On July 2nd, 1937, she and her navigator, Fred Noonan, took off from Lae, New Guinea. They were headed for a tiny speck in the Pacific called Howland Island. It was a long, dangerous leg of the journey. They never made it. After a few garbled radio messages, they vanished. The official story, the one the US government has stood by for decades, is that they ran out of fuel, crashed into the ocean, and sank without a trace. It's a clean, tragic, and simple end. But a lot of people don't buy it. They never have. For them, the story isn't about a simple accident. It's about something darker. It's about espionage, capture, and a massive government cover-up that has lasted for over 80 years. This is the Japanese capture theory. It's a story that turns Amelia Earhart from a victim of bad luck into a secret agent for the United States, a casualty of a shadow war that was brewing long before Pearl Harbor. And it suggests our own government chose to let her and Noonan be erased from history rather than admit the truth. The theory goes like this. Earhart and Noonan didn't crash into the ocean. They flew off course, either by mistake or on purpose, and ended up far from Howland Island. They found land, but it was the wrong land. They came down in the Marshall Islands, a string of atolls then controlled by the Japanese Empire. And Japan held these islands under a mandate from the League of Nations after World War I. They were supposed to be demilitarized, but Japan was secretly fortifying them, building airstrips and naval bases. They didn't want any outsiders seeing what they were up to. So when a famous American plane dropped out of the sky, the Japanese military would have swarmed it, where Earhart and Noonan, exhausted and lost, would have been taken into custody. To the local Japanese command, they weren't just lost aviators, they were spies. Why else would they be flying a state-of-the-art plane equipped with long-range radio and mapping cameras so far into Japanese-controlled territory? They would have been captured, their plane either hidden or destroyed, and they would have been shipped off for interrogation. The story then moves to Saipan, another Japanese stronghold. There, it's said, Earhart and Noonan were held in a prison. They were questioned, likely harshly, and there, in Japanese custody, they eventually died from disease, execution, or some other unknown cause. This is a wild story, it sounds like a movie plot, and for it to be true, two huge things have to be proven. First, that they were actually captured, and second, that the US government knew about it and deliberately hid the truth. This is where the whole thing gets incredibly complicated and murky. It's a world of third-hand accounts, deathbed confessions, and clues that seem to evaporate as soon as you look at them too closely. The evidence for the capture part of the theory comes almost entirely from eyewitnesses. These aren't official reports or government documents, they are stories passed down through generations or told by old men and women decades after the fact. The most compelling stories come from the Marshall Islanders themselves. For years, American researchers, most notably a man named Fred Gorner, who wrote a best-selling book on the topic in the 1960s, traveled to these remote islands and interviewed the locals. And they heard things, a lot of things. On Mealy Atoll, several islanders claimed they remembered a big, loud plane, unlike any they had ever seen, landing in the lagoon. They said a man and a woman, both white, were on board. They looked sick and tired. Soon after, a Japanese ship arrived and took the two people and their plane away. Some islanders said the plane was damaged but mostly intact. They said the woman had short hair like a man. They said the man was tall. These descriptions fit Earhart and Noonan. These stories were repeated with slight variations by different people across the atoll. They seemed to corroborate each other. To believers in the capture theory, this was the smoking gun. These people had no reason to lie. They were just telling you what they saw as children. Then the story picks up on Saipan. After World War II, when the US military took over the island, American soldiers started hearing rumors. They heard stories from the locals about two white flyers, a man and a woman, who were held in the prison in the main town, Garapan. They heard the Japanese called them spies. They heard they were executed. One of the most famous Saipan witnesses was a woman named Josephine Blanco. As a young girl, she lived near the prison. She claimed she saw the two Americans being held. She said she would peek through the fence. She remembered the woman had short hair and wore pants, which was unusual. She said they were kept separate from the other prisoners. Then, one day, they were gone. She heard they had been executed. Other people on Saipan told similar stories. A man said his uncle was part of the execution squad. Another said he saw their graves. There were even American witnesses. A former U.S. Marine said that after his unit secured Saipan, he was told by his commanding officer to open a safe in a building. Inside, he claimed, was a briefcase containing Amelia Earhart's papers. He said he was told to shut up about it and never mention it again. Another soldier claimed he was part of a detail that dug up two skeletons from an unmarked grave, believed to be the flyers, and that the remains were secretly flown off the island. Put it all together, and it paints a pretty convincing picture. You have witnesses at the crash site in the Marshalls. You have witnesses to their imprisonment and death on Saipan. You even have American military personnel who say they handled evidence. It seems to connect the dots from their disappearance to their final resting place. So, if all this is true, why would the US government hide it? Why wouldn't they demand the return of a national hero? Why let Japan get away with it? This is the heart of the cover-up theory. And the answer, proponents say, lies in the year 1937. In 1937, America was not the superpower it is today. The country was still clawing its way out of the Great... The public was overwhelmingly isolationist. No one wanted another war after the horrors of World War I. President Franklin D. Roosevelt knew that Japan was becoming a major threat in the Pacific. He knew they were militarizing, invading China, and building bases on those mandated islands in violation of international treaties. But he was hamstrung by public opinion and a Congress that wanted to stay out of foreign conflict. The theory suggests that FDR's administration came up with a plan. They needed eyes on those Japanese bases. They needed to know what was happening, but they couldn't send a military plane without risking war. So they turned to a civilian. Someone famous, someone with a legitimate reason to be flying a long-range plane across the Pacific, Amelia Earhart. According to this version of events, her around-the-world flight wasn't just for adventure. It was a cover for an intelligence mission. The plane, a Lockheed Electra 10E, was heavily modified. It had extra fuel tanks for extreme range, a big antenna for long-range communication, and the latest navigation equipment. It was also allegedly fitted with high-resolution mapping cameras. Her flight path, especially the leg to Howland Island, would take her right over or very near the Japanese-controlled Marshall Islands. The plan was simple. As she flew, she would take pictures. The information would be invaluable to the U.S. military. It was a huge risk for her and for the country. If she made it, she would be a hero and the U.S. would have vital intelligence. If she got caught, the government would have plausible deniability. She was just a civilian pilot who got lost. The government could deny any involvement. So when she disappeared and intelligence reports started trickling in that she had been picked up by the Japanese, FDR was in an impossible position. If he publicly accused Japan of capturing an American spy, it would be a diplomatic catastrophe. Japan would either deny it or worse, admit it and produce evidence of her spying. The American public would be outraged, not just at Japan, but at their own government for running a secret mission that could drag them into a war they didn't want. The isolationist movement would have a field day. Roosevelt's hands were tied. The only option, the theory claims, was to do nothing. To publicly mount a massive search and rescue operation, the biggest in history at the time, all while knowing she was probably already in Japanese hands. They searched the waters around Howland Island, a place they knew she wasn't. It was a performance for the public. When the search inevitably failed, they declared her lost at sea. It was a clean story that avoided an international crisis. Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan were sacrificed for the sake of pre-war peace. And after the war, why not tell the truth then? Well, by then the narrative was set. The FDR was a revered wartime president. Why tarnish his legacy by revealing he sent a beloved icon on a spy mission that got her killed? Why admit the government had lied to the public for years? Some secrets, once buried, are easier to just leave buried. The original reports were likely classified, then lost or destroyed. The people involved had moved on or died. The institutional memory was gone. The cover-up just continued out of inertia. This entire narrative, the capture and the cover-up, is incredibly compelling. It's a story of intrigue, betrayal, and high-stakes geopolitics. It turns a random accident into a deliberate act of patriotism and a cold-blooded political calculation. The problem is, when you start to poke at it, the whole thing begins to look very shaky. Let's go back to the evidence. The eyewitness accounts are the foundation of the whole theory. But memory is a funny thing, especially over decades. Most of these interviews were conducted in the 1960s, a full 25 years or more after the event. The witnesses were recalling things they saw as children. Their memories could have been blurred by time or influenced by the stories they heard from others later. The legend of Earhart was well known in the Pacific after the war. It's possible that people started to conflate different events or unconsciously fit their memories to the famous story. There are also inconsistencies. Some Marshall Islanders said the plane landed in the lagoon. Others said it crashed on the reef. Some said the flyers were taken away peacefully. And others said they were treated harshly. The descriptions of the plane weren't always a perfect match for Earhart's Electra. On Saipan, the stories are also problematic. No two accounts of the supposed gravesite matched up. The U.S. military has official records of every soldier who served on Saipan. The names of the men who claimed to find the briefcase or dig up the bodies don't match any official service records. They either use fake names or they were never there. As for Josephine Blanco, her story changed over the years. In some tellings, she saw them clearly. In others, it was just a quick glimpse. It's not that these people were necessarily lying, it's just that their testimony is not the kind of hard, verifiable evidence you can build a solid case on. It's folklore, then there's the physical evidence, or rather, the complete lack of it. For all the stories, no one has ever produced a single authenticated piece of the Electra from the Marshall Islands or Saipan. No serial numbers, no wing fragments, no engine parts, nothing. The Japanese are meticulous record keepers, yet no official Japanese document has ever been found that mentions the capture of Earhart or Noonan. The U.S. intelligence services scoured captured Japanese files after the war, looking for exactly this kind of information. They found nothing. What about that briefcase full of her papers or the bones? They vanished. The people who claimed to see them had no proof. It's always a story about something someone else saw or something that was taken away by a mysterious officer. It's always one step removed from concrete reality. In 2017, the theory got a huge jolt of publicity. The History Channel ran a documentary that featured a photograph discovered in the U.S. National Archives. The photo showed a group of people standing on a dock in Jalou Atoll in the Marshalls. On the far right, a figure with their back to the camera looked, to some, like Fred Noonan. Sitting on the edge of the dock was a white person who, the documentary claimed, could be Amelia Earhart. In the background, a Japanese ship was towing a barge, and on that barge was a blurry shape that was said to be the Electra. It seemed like the smoking gun everyone had been waiting for, but it fell apart almost immediately. The photo was debunked within days. A Japanese military blogger found the original source of the photo. It was from a Japanese travelogue book published in 1935, a full 2 years before Earhart disappeared. The people in the photo were not Earhart and Noonan. The case collapsed. It was a perfect example of how much people want this theory to be true. They saw what they wanted to see in a blurry old photograph. The spy mission premise is also built on speculation. There is no primary evidence that Roosevelt or anyone in his administration recruited Earhart. Her husband, George Putnam, always denied it. Her friends and colleagues said she was obsessed with the flight for its own sake, to be the first to circle the globe at the equator. The idea that her plane was full of secret cameras is also unproven. It was a standard, if heavily modified, civilian aircraft. The things that made it good for a long-distance flight range, radio equipment, would also make it a plausible spy plane, but that doesn't mean it was one. So where does that leave us? On one side you have the official story, the crash and sink theory. It's supported by Earhart's own last radio transmissions. She was clearly lost, running out of fuel, and desperately searching for Howland Island. The Itasca, the Coast Guard cutter waiting for her, heard her messages. She sounded panicked. We are on the line 157, 337. We are running on line north and south. That's the last thing anyone clearly heard. The simplest explanation is that her fuel ran out and she went down. The Pacific is incomprehensibly vast and incredibly deep in that area. The chances of finding wreckage, even with modern technology, are minuscule. This explanation requires no conspiracies, no secret missions, and no cover-up. It's just a sad story about two skilled aviators who were pushed beyond their limits and lost to the sea. On the other side, you have the Japanese capture theory. It's a compelling, dramatic narrative filled with intrigue and heroism. It gives a deeper meaning to her death. She wasn't just lost, she was a patriot who died in service to her country. And it feeds into a deep-seated distrust of government. The idea that our leaders would lie to us, that they would sacrifice an American hero for political reasons, is a powerful and unsettling thought. But this theory is built on a foundation of sand. It rests on decades-old memories, unverified rumors, and evidence that crumbles under scrutiny. It requires you to believe in a massive, perfectly executed conspiracy involving hundreds, if not thousands, of people in both the US and Japanese governments, a conspiracy that has held for over 80 years with not a single document ever leaking. That's a very high bar for belief. There is another major alternative theory, the Nikomororo hypothesis, which suggests she landed on a deserted atoll, then called Gardner Island, and survived for a time as a castaway. This theory has some forensic evidence, like bones found on the island that might be hers, but it too remains unproven. It sits somewhere between the simple tragedy of the official story and the grand conspiracy of the capture theory. Ultimately, the Japanese capture theory persists not because the evidence for it is strong, but because the evidence against it isn't absolute either. The core of the Earhart mystery is a vacuum. Because her plane and her body were never found, there is no final proof. And into that vacuum, any story can be poured. The crash and sink story is the most probable, but it's also the most boring and the least satisfying. It leaves us with nothing but an empty ocean. The capture theory gives us something to hold on to. It gives us heroes and villains, it gives us a secret history, it's a story that feels more significant, more worthy of a figure as legendary as Amelia Earhart. People want to believe that her disappearance meant something more, and they want to believe that governments keep secrets. In this case, they might be right about the second part, but that doesn't mean they are right about the first. Did the government cover up what happened to Amelia Earhart? The honest answer is that there is no credible evidence to suggest they did. There is no proof that she was captured, and therefore there was nothing to cover up. The story of her being a spy who died on Saipan is most likely just that, a story. A myth that grew to fill the void left by her vanishing plane. It's a fascinating, compelling myth, but until a piece of the Electra with a serial number washes up on a beach in the Marshall Islands, the simplest, saddest explanation remains the most likely one. She just flew out into the endless blue and never came back.